how you start the Nimzo Larsen. We start off with a little bit of B3. And keep in mind, if you are learning this as a full repertoire for both white and black, you can play B3, but also when we're flipping the board around, keep in mind it's the pawn to the right of the queen. So say, for instance, after E4, we got B6. And the ideas that I'm going to show you for white in this video can apply to black. You're just a tempo down. So that is called the Owens defense. So starting off with 1B3, we've got two major branches in the Nimzo Larsen that we're going to cover today with D5 and E5. These are the two major main lines. So starting off with the first, with D5, we've got a classical game. The reason that the opening is called the Nimzo Larsen, one of the earliest games in the database was from 1927 in New York, where Aaron Nimzovich was playing against Rudolf Spielmann. And this turned out to be one of the classical games of the variation, hence the Nimzo part of it. Bent Larsen was a very prominent chess player in the 1970s, and he brought it some fame being he played it at the top level and had pretty good results with it. So going forward with the line, the main thing that you want to note here is the bishop's long diagonal is really focusing on G7, and that's really one of the major points of the opening, is focusing in on that. And what black is trying to do with C5 and D5 is to be able to play D4 and blunt the eye of the bishop. So you do not want this to happen, so you want to lay claim to the D4 square. Now, black continues to press to be able to play D4. And this is why we play bishop B5. So, analyzing this opening with some students, I had the question here, what happens instead of knight C6 if they play H6 and prevent this bishop B5? Well, here's a quick line emphasizing what to do when you can't get the optimal development being by able to put the bishop on B5. So F4 to really clamp down on the E5 square. And you see how with the knight, pawns, and bishop, these squares are really controlled by white. We simply put the bishop on E2 because it is the best square it can go to. And we complete our development this way. So going back to the main line, and also I should note before doing that, that white's queen is typically going to make a journey to G3. That way it's looking at G7 to where it's a focal point of attack. Alright, so coming back to the main game, after E3, we pin it. That way D4 is not a possibility. F4, clamping down on the squares, and you're going to see these types of maneuvers over and over. Knight F3, and castles. And before we move on, I should definitely say you don't want to mix the move order up too much here, because you could run into some serious problems, say, after D3. Because Queen A5 check, and your bishop is going to be in a bad way. So that's why we castle on move 7. Bishop E7, and this is one of the notes. The only blemish that I really saw when analyzing the game by Nimzovich was he didn't wait to capture on C6, which will come up in a few moves. We really want black to play this move A6 because this coaxes him and he's wasting a tempo. We want to capture on C6 anyway because we don't have a good square for our bishop. So we're waiting on this A6 move. So when we're capturing, A6 can't really be justified, so he's helping us out. And then we're just going back to this maneuver that we discussed before, getting the queen on a good square and really eyeing G7 for upcoming attacks. So going back to the main game, after white castled, bishop E7 was played, and Nimzovich played bishop takes here. I feel like he could have waited a couple moves, like played knight D2 and more preparatory moves, and maybe black has that knee-jerk reaction with A6, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this move. I just feel like white could have pressed for more by waiting. So after captures, knight E5, and begin to see how white develops some serious threats, because if it was white to move here, you'd be able to play knight takes d7, and then queen takes g7 mate. So black really needs to react actively here in order to prevent a massive attack, because white has many options with the rook lifts, and just generally all the pieces are kind of positioned to go after black's king directly. Captures and defends against the mate. White continues by pressing the on, defend the pawn, don't make it free. And all of white's pieces are coordinated, and yet black's aren't. So, drops a pawn in order to get this position. And after queen h5, I'll let you look up the game in the database, because Nimzo has excellent technique with a knight dominating the bishop in this type of position and goes on to win. Now we'll go back to the other line, which in practice is seen more frequently, e5. So after bishop b2, we're attacking the pawn, and we're just constantly putting pressure. So first I'm going to show you what the ideal situation is, what you're trying to go for, and then I'm going to show you what the actual main line is for black. So after knight c6, he's defending the pawn, and much like the previous line, our scheme of development is very much the same. Now, we want to be able to place the f1 bishop on b5 to clip the knight in order to win the pawn. So first e3, and say if d5, we get bishop b5, and we're getting our dream position. He's got to defend again. And then the exclam move, the tricky move, f4. Because if he moves the pawn in any capacity, and I've seen this happen very frequently, they'll take the pawn not thinking. At this point, bishop takes, and you've lost a pawn and the rook to follow. Black can struggle a little bit. Don't get mated here. Don't get greedy and take the rook. Stop the mate. And then you win free stuff. So this is the ideal situation, what you're going for. So going back to this position, instead of d5, where we get bishop b5 in an excellent position, knight f6 is the actual main line. And this is an interesting position because you go along with this bishop b5 idea, and the next handful of moves are extremely counterintuitive to opening theory, but they have direct rationale, which are easy to understand. So first, we tell you guys not to put bishops in front of pawns, because you're going to have to move again. Well, in this situation, it's okay for black, because if white goes on to take the knight, you're recapturing with the d pawn, and you won't have to move the bishop again. It's just defending the weakness. So then white goes, well, you put your bishop on a weird square, so I'm going to play knight a3. My idea is to be able to go to the c4 square with my knight and attack your bishop. So then black has an excellent idea here, which is another counterintuitive one. The knight also goes to the edge of the board, stopping knight c4. So now white can't justify his bishop being on b5, so he goes back. a6, really stopping the idea of the knight going to b5, another reason the bishop dropped back. So then white gets some space, so black can't, c4, knight c2, and we go for a hedgehog-like structure for white, and that's where I'll end the line and the main line of the database. So hopefully the information has been informative and will be a good starting point for you in your research on the